What happens when a small-town gathering takes an unexpected turn, all sparked by an 8-year-old girl's bold question about God? In a quiet church fellowship hall, surrounded by stained glass and whispers of faith, Donald Trump finds himself faced with a moment unlike any other. The innocence of a child meets the weight of his words, creating a ripple effect that transforms not just her, but the entire community. This is a story of faith, humanity, and one question that brought everyone to tears.
In a world where faith often speaks in whispers, a single question rang out like a bell in a small Louisiana church fellowship hall. Through stained glass windows, the late afternoon sun painted the wooden floors in jewels of amber and sapphire, blessing an unlikely gathering of souls. No one expected transformation that evening, not the retired teacher who hadn't stepped foot in church since her husband's passing, not the immigrant family clutching their grandmother's recipe for pecan squares, not even Donald Trump himself, standing at the worn podium where generations of prayers had been spoken. But when 8-year-old Lily Mitchell stood, her grandmother's Bible pressed close to her heart, her question would strip away all pretense, all politics, all barriers between strangers. What followed wasn't just an answer. It was a moment of raw humanity that left not just the child, but an entire community forever changed. The Fellowship Hall of First Baptist Church held generations of memories within its walls. Countless baptisms, tearful farewells, joyous celebrations, and quiet moments of prayer. Today, those memories seem to whisper through the late afternoon air, mixing with the familiar scent of old hymnals and wood polish that Martha Henderson had used every Saturday for 40 years. The usual rows of metal folding chairs had been arranged with careful precision, each one a potential seat for transformation. Through the stained glass windows, scenes of biblical parables cast their colored shadows across the worn wooden floors. Daniel in the lion's den, David facing Goliath, ordinary people called to extraordinary moments of courage. The space seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that tonight would add another chapter to its sacred history. Already, the community had begun to gather. Eleanor Washington, the retired school teacher who had taught 3 generations of local children, including young Lily Mitchell, made her way carefully down the center aisle, leaning on her grandson Michael's arm. The Martinez family worked quietly near the kitchen, Maria's famous pecan squares a reminder of how faith could smell like butter and brown sugar. James Carter stood near the back, his first time in the building since his wife Mary's funeral 2 years ago, his calloused hands remembering the familiar touch of hymnal pages. Each person who entered carried their own stories, their own burdens, their own hopes for what this evening might bring. Yet none could have predicted how a child's simple question would weave their individual threads into a tapestry of unexpected grace. The first signs of Trump's arrival rippled through the fellowship hall, like waves on still water. The distant hum of motorcade engines, the practiced efficiency of Secret Service agents moving through sacred space. But something shifted as he stepped through those wooden doors. Something no political playbook could have predicted. The usual commanding presence that filled stadiums and dominated headlines seemed to gentle itself beneath the colored light streaming through generations-old stained glass. His steps slowed, his voice softened, as if recognizing that here, in this space, that had witnessed countless prayers and possibilities, he was simply another soul seeking answers. The community's reaction wasn't the usual political fervor of campaign stops or rallies. Instead, a different kind of energy moved through the gathered souls. Martha Henderson noticed how Trump's hand lingered on the old wooden podium, as if reading the stories embedded in its grain. Eleanor Washington saw how he paused to help Mrs. Peterson retrieve her dropped glasses, a simple act of kindness that reminded her of Rose's saying about how God often works through unexpected moments. Even the Secret Service agents seemed touched by the atmosphere, their professional detachment softening as they took in the hand-stitched banners speaking of faith and hope, the well-worn hymnals in their wooden racks, the quiet dignity of a space where politics held no power over prayers. Morning preparations. Dawn crept into Lily's bedroom like a gentle whisper, painting her walls in soft pastels that reminded her of the watercolors her grandmother Rose used to love. She had barely slept, her 8-year-old heart too full of purpose for rest. The morning light caught the silver cross necklace hanging on her bedpost, Rose's final gift to her, given just weeks before heaven called her home. Lily reached out to touch it, remembering how her grandmother's hands had trembled with joy as she'd fastened it around her neck. Sometimes, Rose had said, faith looks like having the courage to ask the questions that live in your heart. The yellow dress hung on her closet door like a piece of captured sunshine, its fabric still holding memories of that Easter morning when Rose had helped her choose it. This one, her grandmother had said, running her fingers along the Peter Pan collar, because yellow is the color of hope, and hope is what keeps faith alive. Now, as Lily slipped it over her head, the fabric settled around her like a warm embrace, carrying echoes of Rose's gentle laugh and the scent of her lavender perfume that somehow always reminded Lily of prayers and possibility. Sarah watched from the doorway as her daughter stood before the mirror, small fingers working to smooth down unruly curls, just as Rose had done countless times before. The similarity caught in her throat, the same determined tilt of the chin, the same quiet strength that seemed too big for such a small frame. These past 3 months since Rose's passing had transformed Lily in ways that broke and healed Sarah's heart all at once. The child who had once danced through life with carefree abandon now carried a depth in her eyes that spoke of questions too profound for her years. Finding Rose's Bible exactly where it had always been, on the small table by the window where morning light could catch its gold-leafed pages, felt like discovering a treasure map. Lily lifted it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for precious things, her fingers tracing the well-worn leather cover that bore the imprints of decades of faithful seeking. Inside, Rose's handwriting filled the margins with wisdom shared across generations, little notes about faith and doubt, love and loss, questions and discoveries that had shaped their family's spiritual journey. Each penciled word felt like a piece of Rose's heart, preserved between pages that had witnessed countless prayers and possibilities. "Are you sure about this, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, moving to help Lily with the last stubborn button on her dress. The morning light caught them both, mother and daughter wrapped in a moment of shared purpose and profound love. Lily met her mother's eyes in the mirror, and for a moment Rose's wisdom seemed to flow between them like a current of grace. "Grandma always said," Lily responded, her young voice steady with conviction, "that sometimes God gives you a question that won't let you rest until you ask it." Sarah's hand stilled on her daughter's shoulders, remembering how her mother had said those exact words to her years ago, on another morning when faith had required courage. Martha Henderson's hands moved with practiced grace across the fellowship hall's worn wooden surfaces, her fingers finding familiar grooves in the podium where generations of pastors had rested their Bibles. 40 years of Saturday mornings spent preparing this sacred space had taught her that every speck of dust held a story. Every creak in the floorboards echoed with memories of prayers answered and hearts healed. Today felt different, though. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed to carry a weight of expectation she couldn't quite name. But something about young Lily Mitchell's determination, about the way she carried her grandmother Rose's Bible, just as Mary used to carry hers, had drawn him here today. The morning sun caught his wedding ring, still firmly in place despite all the doubts and anger that had followed Mary's passing. "Sometimes," Mary's voice echoed in his memory, "God brings us back to the places we've run from, just to show us He never left." The Martinez family's kitchen buzzed with activity as Maria folded the last batch of her famous pecan squares into wax paper, each one a prayer wrapped in butter and brown sugar. Diego helped Sophia with her hair ribbon, the same shade of blue as the Virgin Mary's robe in their village church back home. The recipe had been her grandmother's, Abuela Rosa, who had taught her that faith wasn't just found in prayer books and church pews, but in the way we feed each other's bodies and souls. En nuestra familia, Maria told Sophia, catching her daughter's uncertain reflection in the window, faith is like bread. It needs to be shared to be real. The morning light played through the stained glass, casting pools of color across the floor like scattered gems. Rose used to say, Martha shared, helping Jenny with her burden, that every time we enter this place, we should expect a miracle, not the kind that parts seas or moves mountains, but the kind that happens when ordinary people gather with extraordinary hope. Together, they worked in companionable silence, each small task a prayer for what was to come. The summer before Rose passed, she had taken Lily to the lake every Wednesday afternoon, their own private ritual of faith and connection. They would sit on the weathered pier, their feet dangling over crystal clear water, Rose's worn Bible open between them like a bridge across generations. These weren't simple Bible study sessions. They were moments where the deepest questions could surface without fear. Lily remembered how her grandmother would listen to her doubts about prayer, about heaven, about why bad things happen to good people, with the same patience she used when teaching Lily to bake her famous apple pies. Faith, Rose would say, watching the sunlight dance across the water, is like this lake. Sometimes it's clear as glass, and sometimes it's deep and mysterious. But it's always there, holding us up if we trust it enough to let it. Now, 3 months after Rose's passing, Sarah could still hear her mother's voice in every creak of the floorboards, every hymn hummed absently while washing dishes, every quiet moment when questions felt bigger than answers. James Carter's grief had carved itself into the familiar routines of his auto repair shop, where Mary's absence echoed loudest in the small things. The empty chair by his desk, where she used to do the books, the radio permanently tuned to the gospel station she loved, the coffee mug she had painted for him still sitting unwashed in the break room sink. 2 years had passed, but some days the loss felt as fresh as that first morning without her. Mary had been more than his wife. She had been the heart of their faith, the one who could find God's presence in engine grease and tire changes, who taught him that every repair job was a kind of prayer. Look deeper, she would say, her eyes twinkling with that special light that had first drawn him to her 40 years ago. Sometimes God's greatest miracles happen under the hood. The Martinez family's journey to Louisiana had been written in tears, prayers, and the kind of courage that comes only from desperate hope. Maria still remembered that final night in their village, how Abuela Rosa had pressed her rosary into Maria's hands, whispering prayers of protection over Diego and young Sofia. They had arrived with nothing but faith and a few family recipes folded carefully between the pages of their Bible. Those first months had been the hardest strange words, stranger customs, and nights spent wondering if they had made the right choice. But then, they had found First Baptist, where Martha Henderson's quiet welcome and Rose Mitchell's gentle wisdom had helped them transplant their faith into new soil. Faith, Abuela Rosa had told them before they left, is like a seed. It grows wherever God plants it. Eleanor Washington's teaching career had spanned 4 decades, 3 generations of Mitchell women, and countless moments where faith and education had intertwined like threads in a tapestry. She had taught Sarah Mitchell in 3rd grade, watched her grow into a woman of quiet strength, and then welcomed little Lily into her classroom, just as Rose's illness began to take hold. Through it all, Eleanor had witnessed how faith flowed through this family like a river, sometimes peaceful, sometimes turbulent, but always moving forward. She remembered the day Rose had come to help with the classroom Christmas party, how she had turned a simple cookie decorating session into a lesson about how God's love, like frosting, could make even broken things beautiful. Teaching, Rose had told her that day, is just another way of sharing faith. Sometimes through words, sometimes through actions, but always through love. Martha Henderson watched the early morning light spill through the stained glass windows, painting the fellowship hall in jewels of amber and sapphire. The first arrivals trickled in like a gentle stream. Agnes Peterson, with her walker decorated in artificial flowers. Young Tommy Williams helping his grandmother with her heavy purse. The Martinez family carrying boxes of Maria's famous pecan squares that somehow made Faith smell like butter and cinnamon. Martha's hands moved automatically, straightening already straight tablecloths, but her heart was tuned to the quiet symphony of community, building itself person by person. Rose had always said that the hour before any gathering was sacred time, when the air itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what God might do. James Carter's arrival caught everyone by surprise. His first time back since Mary's funeral had the whole room holding its breath. But before awkwardness could settle, Maria Martinez approached him with a warm pecan square wrapped in a paper napkin, sharing how Mary had once taught her to make American-style pie crust when she'd first arrived in town. The two stood near the refreshment table, their conversation soft but healing, as if Mary's spirit had orchestrated this moment of connection. Martha noticed how James's shoulders, usually tight with grief, began to relax as he and Maria traded stories about Mary's kitchen wisdom and her habit of humming hymns while she baked. Eleanor Washington arrived with her grandson Michael, her silver hair catching the morning light like a crown. She made her way through the gathering crowd with the practiced grace of someone who had spent 40 years commanding classroom attention, stopping to greet each person by name, remembering details about their lives that made them feel seen and valued. When she reached the young mother who had recently lost her job, Eleanor took both her hands, whispering something that made the woman's eyes fill with grateful tears. Rose had always said Eleanor had a gift for finding the hurt places in people's hearts and touching them with grace. The fellowship hall began to pulse with an energy that reminded Martha of countless revival meetings. But this felt different, more intimate, more profound. She watched as Sophia Martinez helped Jenny arrange flowers in mason jars, the pastor's wife and the teenage girl sharing quiet laughter as they worked. Near the piano, Agnes Peterson had found herself surrounded by a group of young children, their eyes wide as she told them stories about the church's history, about the faithful souls who had walked these floors before them. The morning light streamed through the windows stronger now, and Martha could almost hear Rose's voice saying, "Sometimes the holiest moments happen before the service even begins." Near the old piano, where Mary Carter used to play during Sunday services, an unexpected conversation bloomed between James Carter and Sophia Martinez. The teenager had been arranging hymnals when James mentioned how his late wife would always mark the pages with pressed flowers. Sophia's eyes lit up as she shared how her abuela in Mexico did the same thing, using rose petals from her garden. "My grandmother Rose used to do that too," Lily added, joining them with her own well-worn Bible. The three stood there, connected by this simple tradition that crossed generations and cultures, their fingers gently touching the dried petals that still marked favorite passages. James felt Mary's presence in that moment, as if she were smiling at this small miracle of shared memories. Eleanor Washington found herself surrounded by a group of young mothers, their children playing quietly nearby with puzzle pieces from the Sunday school room. The conversation had started simply enough. Someone mentioned Rose's famous apple pie, but soon deepened into something more profound. Each woman began sharing stories of Rose's quiet influence in their lives. The time she sat all night in the hospital with Janet's sick baby, the way she taught Sarah's youngest to pray using cookie dough and patient love, how she somehow always knew exactly when someone needed a phone call or a casserole. Eleanor watched as these shared memories wove the women closer together, their tears and laughter creating a tapestry of grace. Maria Martinez worked in the church kitchen, arranging her pecan squares on Rose's old serving plates, a gesture that felt both honoring and holy. As she worked, she found herself sharing with Martha Henderson the story of her first week in Louisiana, when Rose had shown up at their tiny apartment with a pot of gumbo and a Spanish-English Bible. "She couldn't speak my language," Maria remembered, her voice thick with emotion, "but she spoke the language of love." Martha nodded, adding her own memory of how Rose had convinced the church to offer English classes, saying that faith needed no translation, but love needed every tool available. By the fellowship hall's big windows, where afternoon light painted everything in soft gold, Agnes Peterson sat with Tommy Williams, an unlikely pair sharing stories about Rose's Sunday school lessons. Agnes, in her 80s, and Tommy, barely 13, discovered they had both learned the same Bible verse from Rose, though decades apart. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Tommy shared how Rose had explained it using his video games as a metaphor, making Agnes laugh in delight at how Rose could make ancient truths feel fresh and relevant to each generation. Jenny, the pastor's wife, found herself drawn into a conversation with Sarah Mitchell near the old photographs lining the fellowship hall walls. They stood before a faded picture of Rose leading a youth group camping trip in 1985, her smile radiant as she helped teenagers build a campfire. "She taught me that ministry isn't about big gestures," Sarah shared, touching the frame gently. "It's about being present in the small moments, about showing up when people need you most." Jenny felt her own understanding of ministry shifting as she listened, realizing how Rose's legacy lived on in every person whose life she had touched, each one carrying forward her gentle wisdom in their own way. The fellowship hall hummed with last-minute preparations as Martha Henderson's practiced hands moved through familiar routines that somehow felt different today. She noticed how James Carter had positioned himself near Mary's old piano, quietly tuning the instrument that hadn't been touched since his wife's passing. The act itself seemed like a prayer, each note he tested ringing through the space like memories finding their voice again. Sophia Martinez sat nearby, watching his careful movements, eventually offering to help turn pages of the hymnal he'd opened to Mary's favorite songs. "She always said music was another way to pray," James shared softly, his fingers ghosting over the keys that had known his wife's touch for so many years. Maria Martinez worked with quiet purpose, arranging her pecan squares on Rose's old serving plates, the ones Sarah had insisted she use, saying her mother would have loved knowing her dishes still served the community. The slight tremor in Maria's hands betrayed her nervousness about the approaching moment. But her prayers, whispered in Spanish as she worked, carried the same faith that had brought her family across borders and oceans. Eleanor Washington joined her, adding her own quiet humming of old hymns to Maria's prayers. Together, they created a symphony of hope that seemed to rise like incense toward the rafters, where generations of prayers already lingered. The afternoon light shifted to that golden hour that photographers chase, painting everyone in gentle amber tones that seemed to blur the lines between sacred and ordinary. Rose's presence seemed especially close as the moment approached, as if her lifetime of prayers had helped prepare this space for whatever miracle was about to unfold. The rumble of motorcycles and wailing of sirens pierced the usual tranquility that hung over the sacred grounds, heralding the impending arrival of the controversial figure. A procession of black SUVs, flanked by police escorts, wound its way up the narrow road to the entrance. An imposing man with a shock of orange hair emerged from the lead vehicle once it rolled to a stop, his presence seeming to suck the oxygen from the air and command the attention of all in attendance. Donald Trump had arrived. As the polarizing politician strode towards the hallowed site, he appeared more subdued than his usual bombastic rallies and media appearances. His gait was measured, lacking the pompous swagger he often exhibited, and his expression hinted at a mix of solemnity and curiosity rather than the perpetual scowl or smirk he so often wore. Even for a man who prided himself on bucking traditions and norms, Trump seemed to recognize that this was a space that demanded a modicum of reverence and respect. His eyes scanned the landscape, taking in the ancient architecture and artifacts that testified to the location's vaunted history. The small community that tended to the sacred space had complex reactions to this visit from such a divisive leader. Some were openly hostile, believing Trump's brand of politics and persona were an affront to the virtues and values the site represented. They viewed his presence as an act of hypocrisy and worried that his visit would sully the sanctity of a place they held dear. Others took a more pragmatic view, hoping that seeing the remarkable grounds firsthand might somehow humble Trump or provide him with some profound insight that could influence his leadership for the better. Regardless of their stance, all agreed the atmosphere had shifted dramatically from the usual apolitical serenity to one fraught with tension and deep emotions. The community braced to see what would unfold from this surreal scene. As Trump entered the fellowship hall, an unexpected hush fell over the gathered community. It was as if his presence, usually so brash and divisive, had been tempered by the sacred space. Martha Henderson, who had been busy straightening the refreshment table, found herself locking eyes with the president. In that brief moment, she saw something she hadn't expected. A flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the weight he carried. It was a reminder that beneath the bluster and bravado, there was a human being with his own struggles and doubts. Martha offered a small nod of acknowledgement, a silent gesture of welcome that seemed to catch Trump off guard. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath, wondering how he would respond. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded back, a fleeting connection forged in the midst of uncertainty. Eleanor Washington watched as Trump made his way through the room, his usual swagger replaced by a more measured gait. She noticed how he paused to shake hands with James Carter, the two men exchanging a few quiet words near the old piano. It was a moment of unexpected grace, a recognition of shared loss, and the power of faith to bridge even the widest of divides. Eleanor couldn't help but think of Rose, how she had always believed in the potential for connection and understanding, even in the most unlikely of places. As Trump continued his journey through the gathered community, Eleanor sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a softening of the tension that had initially greeted his arrival. It was as if Rose's spirit of compassion was gently guiding them all towards a higher purpose. Maria Martinez felt a flutter of nerves as Trump approached the refreshment table, his eyes scanning the array of pecan squares she had so carefully arranged. She had poured her heart into those desserts, infusing each one with a prayer for unity and understanding. To her surprise, Trump reached for a square, taking a moment to savor the sweet, nutty flavor. "These are delicious," he said, his tone genuine and appreciative. "Did you make them yourself?" Maria nodded, a flush of pride coloring her cheeks. "Yes, sir. It's a family recipe, passed down from my abuela." Trump smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. Family recipes are the best kind. They hold stories, don't they? In that moment, Maria saw a glimmer of the man beneath the politician, someone who understood the power of shared traditions and the importance of preserving cultural heritage. It was a small but significant connection, one that hinted at the possibility of deeper understanding. As Trump made his way towards the front of the fellowship hall, he found himself face to face with Lily Mitchell. The young girl stood quietly, her grandmother's Bible clutched to her chest, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Trump knelt down to her level, his usual bluster replaced by a gentleness that surprised those watching. "Is that your Bible?" he asked softly, gesturing to the well-worn book in her hands. Lily nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was my grandma's. She gave it to me before she died." Trump's expression softened, a flicker of empathy crossing his features. "Your grandma must have been a very special lady. I bet she's watching over you now, so proud of the strong girl you've become." Lily's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. In that moment, a connection was forged, a recognition of shared loss and the enduring power of love to transcend even death. As the community watched these interactions unfold, a sense of hope began to build. It was as if the sacred space of the fellowship hall was working its magic, stripping away the layers of division and revealing the common threads of humanity. that bound them all together. Sarah Mitchell felt a swell of emotion as she watched her daughter connect with the president, seeing in Lily's eyes the same courage and compassion that had defined Rose's life. James Carter found himself exchanging a knowing glance with Maria Martinez, both of them recognizing the power of simple gestures to bridge even the widest of divides. Martha Henderson and Eleanor Washington shared a smile, their hearts filled with gratitude for the way Rose's legacy continued to inspire and transform. As Trump took his place at the front of the room, the community collectively held its breath, sensing that they were on the cusp of something extraordinary. The seeds of connection had been planted, and now they waited to see what kind of harvest they might yield. As Trump took his place at the front of the fellowship hall, a palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere. It was as if the collective energy of the room, which had been buzzing with anticipation and uncertainty, suddenly coalesced into a shared sense of purpose. The usual trappings of politics and division seemed to melt away, replaced by a deeper understanding of the human struggles and triumphs that had brought them all to this moment. Individuals who had been carrying their own burdens, grief, doubt, fear, found themselves looking at their neighbors with new eyes, recognizing the common threads of resilience and hope that bound them together. Even Trump himself seemed transformed by the sacred space, his usual bravado tempered by a quiet reverence for the stories and lives that had been entrusted to him in this intimate setting. As the room settled into a profound stillness, each person felt the weight of the moment in their own way. Martha Henderson, who had seen countless services and gatherings in this hall, sensed that they were on the cusp of something truly extraordinary. It was as if all the prayers and hymns that had been offered up in this space over the years were converging into a single powerful invocation of the human spirit. Eleanor Washington, who had spent a lifetime teaching others about faith and compassion, felt a deep sense of gratitude for the way this community had come together, setting aside differences to embrace a higher calling. And young Lily Mitchell, clutching her grandmother's Bible with a mix of nerves and determination, knew that the question burning in her heart was not just her own, but a reflection of the yearning for connection and understanding that lived in every soul present. As the final preparations were made and the room collectively held its breath, it was clear that they were all part of something much larger than themselves, a tapestry of human experience that had the power to transform hearts and minds, one story at a time. As the initial questions from the community began, a sense of growing intimacy filled the fellowship hall. People who had known each other for years, but perhaps never shared their deepest struggles, found themselves opening up in ways they hadn't expected. Sarah Mitchell watched as her neighbor, a quiet man who rarely spoke about his personal life, bravely asked Trump about coping with the loss of a child, a pain Sarah knew all too well. Trump's response, filled with empathy and a vulnerability rarely seen in his public persona, seemed to invite others to share their own stories. Slowly but surely, the room transformed from a gathering of strangers into a space of profound connection, where the most human experiences, love, loss, faith, and resilience, became the common threads that bound them all together. As the conversation deepened, Lily Mitchell felt a growing courage rising within her. She had always been a shy child, more comfortable observing than participating, but something about this moment felt different. Watching her mother and the other adults in the room share their stories with such openness and authenticity, Lily began to understand the power of vulnerability. The question that had been burning in her heart, the one she had rehearsed in front of her bedroom mirror and whispered into her pillow at night, suddenly didn't feel so daunting. She clutched her grandmother's Bible tighter, drawing strength from the worn pages that held so many of Rose's own moments of courage and faith. Sarah Mitchell watched her daughter with a mix of pride and trepidation. She knew the weight of the question Lily carried, the one that had haunted their family since Rose's passing. In the days leading up to this event, Sarah had gently encouraged Lily, sharing memories of Rose's own quiet strength and the way she had always encouraged them to speak their truth, even when it was hard. As Lily stood, her grandmother's worn Bible clutched tightly to her chest, a hush fell over the room. It was as if everyone present sensed the significance of the moment, the weight of the question that had been brewing in this young girl's heart. The stillness was palpable, broken only by the soft creaking of wooden pews as people leaned forward in anticipation. Trump, who had been listening intently to the stories and questions shared by the community, now focused his full attention on Lily. His expression was unreadable at first, a mix of curiosity and something else. Perhaps a flicker of recognition, a sense that he too had once grappled with the profound questions of faith and meaning. As Lily took a deep breath, preparing to give voice to the question that had haunted her since her grandmother's passing, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. In that moment, the usual divisions of politics and ideology faded away, replaced by a shared sense of human vulnerability. Every person present understood the courage it took to stand before a room of strangers, to bare one's soul and ask the questions that keep us awake at night. Lily's voice, though soft, carried a strength that belied her young age. "Mr. Trump," she began, her words measured and clear, "what do you believe happens when we die? How do we find hope when we lose someone we love?" The questions hung in the air, raw and honest, a reflection of the universal human yearning for comfort and meaning in the face of loss. Trump's initial reaction was one of surprise, as if he hadn't expected such profound inquiries from someone so young. But as he looked into Lily's eyes, seeing the depth of emotion and the genuine search for truth, his expression softened. He took a step closer to her, kneeling down to meet her gaze at eye level. In that moment, the distance between politician and child, between leader and seeker, dissolved. What remained was a shared human experience, a recognition of the pain and the hope that binds us all together. The room watched, transfixed, as Trump gathered his thoughts, preparing to respond to Lily's questions with the authenticity and compassion they deserved. Here are the 5 paragraphs, with a minimum of 150 words each, totaling 832 words. As Trump knelt before Lily, the room collectively held its breath. In that moment, the usual facade of the powerful politician seemed to fade away, replaced by something more raw and human. He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Lily's, and began to speak. "Lily, those are the questions that keep me up at night too," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I lost my brother Fred, it felt like the world had stopped making sense. I was angry, confused, and so very lost. But in time, I learned that the people we love never really leave us. They live on in the memories we cherish, in the lessons they taught us, and in the love we carry in our hearts." As Trump shared his own story of loss and resilience, the community instinctively drew closer, both physically and emotionally. Chairs scraped softly against the wooden floor as people leaned in, their eyes glistening with empathy and recognition. In the midst of this collective experience, Lily remained at the center, her small frame seemingly anchored by the weight of her grandmother's Bible. As Trump continued to speak, his words painting a picture of hope and resilience in the face of unimaginable loss, Lily felt a warmth blossoming in her chest. It was the feeling of being seen, of having her deepest fears and doubts acknowledged and understood. She looked around the room, taking in the faces of her neighbors, her teachers, her mother, and saw the same emotions reflected back at her. In that moment, Lily realized that the power of human connection could transcend even the darkest of times, that by opening our hearts and sharing our stories, we could find strength, comfort, and the courage to keep moving forward. As the room settled into a profound silence, broken only by the occasional sniffle or rustling of tissues, Lily felt a sense of peace wash over her. It was a peace born not of answers, but of acceptance, the understanding that life's greatest questions, may never have clear-cut solutions, but that we can find solace in the shared journey of seeking. She looked up at Trump, her eyes shining with a mix of tears and gratitude, and saw in his expression a reflection of the same hard-earned wisdom. In that moment, Lily knew that her grandmother's legacy would live on, not just in the pages of her well-worn Bible, but in the hearts of everyone who had gathered here today. She knew that by sharing her own story, by daring to ask the questions that truly mattered, she had become part of something much larger than herself, a tapestry of human experience that would continue to unfold, one connection at a time. As Trump settled into his seat, his gaze became distant, as if he were looking not at the room, but at some inner landscape of memory. "My brother Fred was more than just a sibling," he began, his voice softer than anyone had heard it before. "He was my best friend, my confidant, and in many ways, my anchor." The room seemed to lean in closer, drawn by the raw authenticity in Trump's tone. "When we were kids, Fred was always the one who knew how to make me laugh, even on the toughest days. He had this way of seeing the world that was so full of hope and possibility, no matter what challenges we faced." Trump paused, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. But Fred also struggled with his demons. He battled alcoholism for years, and there were times when I felt helpless, watching him slip away. Slowly, painfully, I began to find my way back to faith, but it wasn't the same faith I had before. It was deeper, more personal, forged in the fires of grief and doubt. I started to see that maybe God hadn't abandoned me after all, but was working through my pain to shape me into something new. Trump's gaze swept the room, taking in the faces of those who had shared their own stories of loss and resilience. I realized that Fred's life, even in its brevity, had a purpose. He taught me about unconditional love, about the power of laughter in the face of adversity, and about the incredible strength of the human spirit. As Trump fell silent, the room seemed to exhale a collective breath. Lily, her face streaked with tears, stood up and walked towards him, her grandmother's Bible clutched to her chest. Without a word, she wrapped her small arms around Trump's waist, burying her face in his suit jacket. Trump looked startled for a moment, then slowly returned the embrace, his own tears finally spilling over. In that moment, the last vestiges of the polished politician fell away, revealing a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow and emerged, not unscathed, but more wholly human. The room watched in reverent silence, understanding that they had just witnessed something rare and precious, a moment of genuine connection, of shared humanity transcending all boundaries. And in that silence, the seeds of something transformative began to take root, promising a future where empathy and understanding might just triumph over division and despair. As Trump's story settled into the hearts of those gathered, the impact was palpable. Tears flowed freely, barriers crumbled, and a profound sense of connection filled the room. Each person seemed to recognize a piece of themselves in the president's raw, honest account of loss, doubt, and the struggle to find meaning in the face of life's greatest challenges. Eleanor Washington, the retired school teacher, found herself reflecting on her own journey of faith. She remembered the dark days after her husband's passing, when the very foundations of her beliefs had been shaken. As she listened to Trump's words, she realized that her own path to healing had been marked by similar moments of anger, questioning, and ultimately, a deeper understanding of God's presence in the midst of pain. With a shaking hand, she reached out and grasped the hand of the young woman beside her, offering a silent gesture of solidarity and support. Across the room, James Carter felt a lump forming in his throat. The president's description of his brother's battle with addiction hit close to home. James had watched his own son struggle with substance abuse, the helplessness and heartache all too familiar. Yet hearing Trump speak of finding purpose in the pain, of allowing loss to shape him into a more compassionate, empathetic person, stirred something in James's heart. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. a sense that perhaps his own family story could be one of redemption and renewal. Maria Martinez, her eyes still glistening with tears, looked around the room and marveled at the transformation taking place. Just hours before, this had been a gathering of strangers, each carrying their own burdens and preconceptions. Now, as shared experiences emerged and understanding flowed, those barriers were breaking down, replaced by a profound sense of human connection. She thought of her own journey, of the countless challenges she had faced as an immigrant in a new land. Yet in this moment, those differences seemed to melt away, overshadowed by the universal experiences of love, loss, and the search for meaning. As the room buzzed with quiet conversations and the rustling of tissues, Sarah Mitchell found herself marveling at the power of vulnerability. She had always known her daughter was special, but watching Lily's innocent question bring a room of adults to their knees was a revelation. In that moment, Sarah realized that perhaps the greatest gift we can give each other is the courage to be authentic, to share our stories and our scars. She looked at her daughter, still clutching her grandmother's Bible, and felt a surge of pride and gratitude. Rose's legacy, it seemed, would live on, not just in their family, but in the hearts of everyone gathered here today. As the initial shock of Trump's revelations began to settle, the room seemed to breathe a collective sigh. It was as if his vulnerability had granted permission for others to unveil their own stories, to share the pieces of themselves they usually kept hidden away. Slowly, at first, then with growing courage, individuals began to speak up, their voices weaving a tapestry of human experience that transcended any single narrative. James Carter was the first to break the silence. He stood, his weathered hands gripping the back of the chair in front of him. "I haven't been in this church since my Mary passed," he began, his voice gruff with emotion. "I thought I could handle it on my own, that I didn't need anyone else. But hearing your story, Mr. President, it made me realize that we all need each other. We all have our struggles, our doubts, and maybe, just maybe, we're not meant to carry them alone." As James spoke, nods of agreement rippled through the room. Maria Martinez, who had been quietly wiping tears from her eyes, found herself rising to her feet. "I came to this country with nothing," she said, her accented English ringing with quiet strength. "I cleaned houses, worked in fields, did whatever I could to survive. There were days when I wanted to give up, when I wondered if God had forgotten about me. But I realize now that He was with me every step, working through the kindness of strangers, through the love of my family." Across the room, unexpected bonds began to form. The banker and the factory worker, the teacher and the small business owner, individuals who might have passed each other on the street without a second glance, now found themselves drawn together by the power of shared experience. They exchanged stories of loss and resilience, of faith tested and renewed. In the sacred space of that humble fellowship hall, the artifice of status and politics fell away, revealing the raw, beautiful humanity beneath. As the stories continued to flow, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The heaviness that had settled over the gathering at the start of the evening gave way to something lighter, more hopeful. Laughter mingled with tears as people recounted moments of unexpected joy, of grace discovered in the midst of hardship. Grandma Rose always said that faith isn't about being perfect, it's about being present, about showing up for each other even when it's hard. Trump knelt to meet Lily's gaze, his own eyes shining with a mix of humility and gratitude. In that moment, he was no longer the president, no longer a political figure. He was simply a man, a fellow traveler on the winding road of human experience. He accepted the Bible with reverent hands, understanding the weight of the trust being placed in him. As the gathering began to disperse, the air hummed with a newfound sense of connection. Hugs were exchanged, numbers swapped, promises made to keep in touch. The challenges waiting beyond the doors of that fellowship hall hadn't disappeared. There would still be struggles, still be moments of doubt and pain. But something fundamental had shifted. a recognition that no one needed to face those trials alone. In the weeks and months that followed, the ripples of that extraordinary evening would continue to spread. Friendships forged in shared vulnerability would blossom into sources of ongoing support and encouragement. Fledgling faith, once shaken by the storms of life, would find new roots in the rich soil of community. And the story of a little girl's question, of a president's raw honesty, would become a touchstone, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, light could be found in the simple, profound act of showing up for one another. Eleanor Washington, the retired teacher who had lived through her own share of loss, found herself reflecting on the power of vulnerability. For so long, she had carried her grief like a secret burden, afraid to let others see the cracks in her facade. But watching Trump and Lily, seeing the way their honesty had opened the door to healing, she realized that true strength lay in embracing one's own humanity. With a deep breath and a silent prayer, Eleanor made a promise to herself to live more authentically, to share her own story with the same courage she had witnessed that night. Across the room, James Carter felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The anger and bitterness he had carried since his wife's passing had begun to dissipate, replaced by a newfound sense of peace. Hearing others speak of their own struggles, of the ways they had found meaning in the midst of pain, had shown him that he was not alone. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to imagine a future beyond grief, a life where Mary's memory could be a source of comfort rather than sorrow. Sarah Mitchell watched as her daughter moved through the room, offering hugs and words of encouragement to those who had shared their stories. They had come seeking answers, seeking solace, and had found something far more profound, a reminder of the inherent goodness of the human spirit. As they stepped out into the night, carrying their newfound sense of connection and purpose, they knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but they also knew that they would not have to walk it alone. The warmth of the evening extended beyond the fellowship hall, weaving itself into the hearts of those who had gathered. Long-standing tensions between community members began to dissolve as shared stories bridged divides. Eleanor Washington, the retired teacher, found herself in an animated discussion with Maria Martinez, sharing their experiences of teaching faith to the younger generation. Across the room, James Carter and Sarah Mitchell talked about their journeys through grief, drawing comfort from one another's honesty. These moments weren't just connections. They were the start of something enduring, a foundation built on empathy. The bonds formed during the gathering carried the promise of a future where differences would no longer overshadow the common threads of humanity and faith that had bound them all together that night. Plans for future gatherings took shape almost instinctively as the group recognized the transformative power of their shared vulnerability. Jenny, the pastor's wife, suggested forming small groups to meet regularly, where neighbors could share their struggles and triumphs in a safe space. Inspired by the evening, Maria offered to host a monthly community dinner, using her family's recipes as a way to foster connection. The evening ignited a sense of hope that rippled outward, touching even those who had come skeptical or guarded. Martha Henderson, who had quietly observed the transformations, reflected on how the night had reaffirmed her faith in the goodness of people. The act of coming together, of seeing each other not as strangers, but as fellow travelers, had planted seeds of optimism. If we can do this here, she thought, we can carry it into our homes, our workplaces, and our everyday lives. Each person carried a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that the connections formed that night were not an endpoint, but the beginning of a shared journey toward healing, understanding, and hope. As the night drew to a close, the fellowship hall buzzed with quiet goodbyes and lingering conversations. Hugs were exchanged, tears wiped away, and hands clasped in shared promises to meet again. Lily, still clutching her grandmother's Bible, stood beside her mother, feeling the weight of something extraordinary. The room, now emptied of chairs and filled with light laughter, seemed to exhale a peaceful contentment, holding the echoes of transformed hearts. Outside, under a canopy of stars, promises made within the hall extended into plans for the future. Maria invited everyone to her home for the first community dinner, while James vowed to repair the piano by the next gathering. As they dispersed, smiles and soft words filled the cool night air. The community had found not just hope, but peace, a quiet reassurance that they would move forward together. The morning after the gathering, the fellowship hall still carried the warmth of the previous night. Martha Henderson, arriving early to clean, noticed something different, a kind of stillness that wasn't emptiness, but fulfillment. The stories shared and the connections formed lingered in the air like a quiet blessing. Around town, conversations about the event began to ripple through the community. Neighbors who rarely exchanged more than polite greetings now stopped to chat, sharing their reflections on the evening and what it had meant to them. For many, it was the first time they had felt seen, heard, and valued in a long while. And that realization began to plant seeds of deeper change. At the Mitchells' home, Sarah watched Lily with quiet awe as the child seemed lighter, more confident, as if a burden had been lifted. Lily spent the morning flipping through her grandmother's Bible, now marked with fresh memories from the night before. "What's next, Mom?" she asked, her young voice filled with determination. Sarah felt a swell of pride and resolve, knowing that they had been part of something transformative. The unity and understanding forged during the gathering had created ripples of hope, spreading through homes, schools, and workplaces. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of connection. It was the start of something lasting. In the weeks that followed, the bonds formed during the gathering grew stronger. The first community dinner at Maria's home drew an even larger crowd than anticipated, filling her modest kitchen with laughter and the warm aroma of pecan squares. The group decided to make these dinners a monthly tradition, each hosted by a different family, to ensure the spirit of togetherness remained alive. Small groups for discussion and prayer began to form as well, meeting in living rooms, coffee shops, and even James Carter's garage, where faith and friendship grew side by side with mechanical repairs. New initiatives began to emerge, fueled by the energy of a community rediscovering its strength. A group of parents, inspired by Lily's courage, organized a youth mentorship program to guide the younger generation in faith and life. The church launched a project to restore the old fellowship hall, ensuring it would continue to serve as a beacon of hope for years to come. Even those who hadn't attended the original gathering felt drawn into the momentum, contributing their skills, time, and resources to this shared vision of renewal. It was as if a dormant spirit had awakened, inspiring action in ways no one had anticipated. Relationships deepened in ways that felt both surprising and inevitable. James Carter, once a solitary figure, found himself surrounded by new friends, each offering him a glimpse of the joy he thought he had lost with Mary's passing. Eleanor Washington became a mentor to Maria Martinez, sharing lessons from her years of teaching that helped Maria navigate challenges in her children's education. Even the Secret Service agents who had been present that night sent a letter of thanks to the community, expressing how the gathering had reminded them of the humanity in their often high-stakes profession. These connections weren't just meaningful, they were life-changing. Lily's growth became one of the most visible markers of the gathering's impact. Once shy and hesitant, she began to radiate a quiet confidence that inspired everyone around her. At school, she spoke up in class more often, sharing her thoughts with a clarity and conviction that surprised even her teachers. At home, she started writing in a journal, recording not just her questions about faith, but also the moments of connection and grace she noticed in everyday life. Sarah often found her daughter reading Rose's Bible by the window, her small fingers tracing the notes her grandmother had left in the margins. It was clear that Rose's legacy was alive and thriving in Lily's young heart. The Bible she had passed down to Lily became a symbol of the community's journey, a reminder that faith, like the worn pages of the book, grows stronger with use. and age. Martha Henderson often remarked that Rose would have been proud to see how her quiet influence had blossomed into a movement of love and understanding that spanned generations. As time went on, the power of faith revealed itself in the community's resilience. Challenges still arose: financial struggles, personal losses, and the daily grind of life. But the way they faced those challenges had changed. Instead of retreating into isolation, they leaned on one another, finding strength in their shared experiences and collective faith. The lessons of the gathering had become a guiding light, reminding them that even in the darkest moments, they were never alone. In the end, the gathering became a story the town would tell for generations, a moment when time seemed to pause, allowing them to see each other and themselves more clearly. For Lily, it was the beginning of a lifelong journey of faith and courage, inspired by her grandmother's wisdom and the community's love. For everyone else, it was a reminder of what was possible when people came together, not as strangers, but as brothers and sisters united by a common hope. Together, they had created something extraordinary, something sacred, a living testament to the power of faith, love, and the human spirit. As the community dispersed under the night sky, a profound sense of unity lingered, a reminder that when we come together, sharing our struggles and hopes, we create something far greater than ourselves. Lily's courage to ask the hard questions had ignited a movement, proving that even the smallest voices can spark the greatest transformations. Rose's legacy lived on in every story shared, every bond strengthened, and every act of kindness that followed. Now, the question turns to you. What connections could you nurture? What questions could you ask to spark change? Take this story as an invitation to reach out, listen, and be present for those around you. If this inspired you, share it with others, because together we can create communities rooted in compassion and hope. Let's continue to build a world where faith, humanity, and love shine brighter than ever.